I also wanted to take the opportunity to just mention for everybody here in the room, but also on Zoom, since not everybody can be here, this all is being recorded. It will be available maybe in a week. And I also want to point out that previous conferences the Center for Advanced Genocide Research organized are also available online. And for our conference, the most kind of important conference we had was in 2016 on the genocide and resistance in Guatemala. And I think this is very relevant for this conference too. So this recording is available on our website. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the chair of this panel. Sarah Ernst is a PhD candidate at the history department here at USC, and they is studying queer history of the Holocaust. Sarah.
Thank you, Will, for the introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of a participant of this conference today. So the next panel will be forcible adoption and transfer of children. The first speaker today will be Rachel Nolan, who is an assistant professor at Boston University in US and Latin American Studies. She was a journalist before becoming a professor, and her work today will be talking about forcible adoptions as a strategy of genocide, Guatemala in the 1980s. So please welcome Rachel Nolan.
Okay, share screen going. Right. To start by thanking the organizers, and thank you for the invitation. I've learned so much at this conference already. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your languages, your laws with me. This has been really enriching for me. I'm often at Latin American history conferences, so it's been great to learn some more. I will also say I listened to many of the presentations from the 2016 conference here after the fact and learned from them. So it's really wonderful to be here with you all in person today. Before I start talking about Guatemala, because I'm the first person to present on this country, this history at this conference, I just want to start by saying it's an absolutely beautiful country where I have been a guest over a long period of time. It is a place full of wonderful people, volcanoes, lakes, and a lot of natural richness. So before I get into some of the history of the violence, I did want to mention that many Guatemalans, both indigenous and non-indigenous, emphasize that Guatemala does not have to be a poor country. Guatemala is a country that is rich in natural resources. It's a question of distribution, land theft, and other kinds of theft and dispossession. It has nothing to do with the country itself. So I wanted to get that out of the way at the beginning. Part of the richness of Guatemala is its indigenous, a big part of the wealth of Guatemala is its indigenous culture and populations. There are 22 distinct, very sophisticated languages, many with subdialects. These are languages that you hear spoken on a regular basis. You walk down the street in a city, you walk down the street in a rural community, you hear Quiche, you hear Kakchikel, you hear Pocomchi, you hear Mam. These are languages that are taught in schools as a result of struggle from the communities for recognition of their rights, particularly after the violence of the Civil War, which I will be talking about. These are languages that you hear on the radio. So we've been hearing about language loss yesterday and last night, and I just wanted to mention that Guatemala is a hub of indigenous life in the Americas. There are many hubs of indigenous life, but if you ever have the opportunity to go and to share, you should really consider it and go if you can. So as a matter of population, as ever, it's a vexed question. What percentage of Guatemala is indigenous? We mentioned this yesterday. There are many indigenous people who are still fearful of discrimination, of violence, so do not reclaim that identity when they're asked by the census. So the official figure is that 40% of Guatemala is indigenous. We know that the real figure is much higher than that. We know that it's over 50%. And Guatemalan activists will often talk about the kind of depression of those numbers, both for allocation of resources and because people are fearful of claiming that identity. It's a population that lives in rural areas. It's a population that lives in urban areas. Okay, so now I do want to get into the history of forcible adoptions during the Civil War and then also after the Civil War period. Before I start, I want to say I'm about to publish a book on this subject next year, and despite the fact that I'm sort of nearing the end of this research, I want to point to some of the limitations in what I, as an outsider, am able to study. I do not speak an Indigenous language. All of my research has been conducted in Spanish, both in existing adoption files, which very unusually are available for researchers in Guatemala. So I'll talk a little bit more about what's in those files, but also through interviews and oral histories that I've done in Guatemala. I really think that my knowledge and understanding of what I'm about to talk about is limited by my inability to speak languages. So I just wanted to flag that right up at the front before I give a little background of the Guatemalan Civil War. So just in brief, what the Guatemalan Civil War was and where the forcible adoptions fit into that is something I'll go over quickly, and then talk about what's in the adoption files and conclude by reaching out to some other histories that we've been talking about here today. So the Civil War was fought from 1960 to 1996. We've been talking about euphemisms here. Civil War is something of a misnomer, right? It's really an episode of state terror, massive state terror. So there were there were two different truth commissions after the Guatemalan Civil War. I criticized them yesterday. I also want to say today they're hugely important. It's very important to be able to say the truth commissions found that over 200,000 Guatemalans were killed during the violence. 93% of them were Maya indigenous, 93%. That's an incredibly high number. And if you ask the victims of the violence, they will point to not just death and disappearance, but also sexual violence, theft of children, and the burning of cornfields, which is a very important part of the genocide in Guatemala, because cornfields are not just sustaining life through food, but are a spiritual sustenance for the Maya people. So the cornfields being burned by US-backed counterinsurgency forces is a very important part of the genocide that's often not highlighted. So after 1996, Guatemala has transitioned into a period of so-called peace, but the same military oligarchy is still in charge of the country with some brief political openings. There's been a lot of Maya political activism. There was a mom-speaking presidential candidate who got 10% of the vote a couple of years ago. That was unthinkable even 15 years ago. So Maya political action is rising in the country at the same time that discrimination and the military oligarchical control over the country remain strong. So those two things kind of exist in tension, but are both there. So one of the kind of post-war reckonings has been not just with the deaths and disappearances, but what happened to children during the war. And this is a story mostly about Indigenous children, not entirely about Indigenous children, but I'm gonna highlight the Indigenous experience today to the extent possible. So the same truth commissions that I mentioned found that there were 5,000 disappeared children during the war, 500 of which have been proved to be put up in adoption. So again, we were talking yesterday about why are we always going back to the UN to tell us what happened to these communities. As a historian, I've had the opportunity to read many of the documents produced by Maya people at the time of the violence. And so one thing that's so striking is before any NGO or any outside body started talking about genocide, the victims themselves were using very similar words. So if you go to southern Mexico and you read some of the refugee files where Guatemalan adults were asking for asylum for themselves and their children, many crossed the border into southern Mexico, which you can see here. The Petén is the jungle in the northernmost part of Guatemala, and people would just cross the border to avoid the army range, to avoid the army. I don't want to step away from the microphone, but they were moving right into to avoid the army attacks, and then petitioning the Mexican government for asylum. And if you read some of those letters, the worst period of the Civil War was very long. It was 36 years, but the worst period of the violence was in the early 1980s, and that's when there was a mass exodus of Maya people, and that's when the genocidal acts occurred. Mostly in the highlands, but not entirely. So in some of these kind of mountainous areas in the northern part of Guatemala. I'll show you guys a couple of pictures in a minute. But I remember reading one letter that I was taken aback by in the archives in Mexico, where a Maya Quiche-speaking man was talking about the destruction of his cornfields. And in his letter requesting asylum to the Mexican government, he said, they came to our village and they wanted to destroy all of us. The phrase was, and he was writing it in the colonizer's language, he was writing in Spanish, saying, querían acabar con todos nosotros, which could not be a clearer way of saying the army came to commit genocide. So you see the kind of self-definition from the community before you ever start seeing some of the trials that went on later. So when people were able to flee with their children, they did. Tragically, many children were kidnapped or lost in the lost is the wrong word, in the kind of fear of flight. Some children were scooped up by Guatemalan military forces. And this is something that you can see in some of, I'm gonna show some photographs from the time and I can talk about what those photographs are and who took them. I wanted you to be able to see some of the occupied communities during the Guatemalan genocide. These are women in Nebaj, which is one of the places where there were both massacres and children forcibly disappeared during the genocide. And this photograph was taken by an American human rights journalist who was one of the few journalists allowed to kind of exist in the occupied areas, probably because she looked a little bit like me, right? She looked like an outsider who the army thought, oh, we don't really want her here, but she's fine, you know, it's okay. And some of her photographs have become actually very important historical memory sources for Guatemalan people and indigenous communities. So she has, you know, gone back and installed some of these photographs in community centers in the affected areas, et cetera. So you can see here this downcast woman wearing her extraordinarily beautiful festive Ixil clothing. Ixil is this ethnic group, is being forced to participate in a parade for Independence Day. So for the independence from Spain in 1982 at the height of the conflict. And then I'll go back to that in a second. And then you can also see in a neighboring village, also Ixil, you can see an interrogation. And the reason I want to show this photograph, as upsetting as it is you can see that children were ever present, right? So the children were subject to the same kind of violence and coercion as the adults, as you can see in this picture. So about the 5,000 disappeared children and the 500 adoptions, where did those kids go? There were no residential schools in Guatemala. Instead, the kids went into the social welfare system and were placed out for adoption with non-Indigenous Guatemalan families and in large numbers with non-Indigenous, obviously, foreign families in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe. And this is a very complicated history. Part of the reason that I wanted to write this book is that it is directly implicating many actors outside of Guatemala in the Guatemalan genocide itself. And I had the opportunity to read the adoption files. So you see not just the Guatemalan state's predations. In many cases, there are lies, there's falsification. These are not reliable documents, right? Because they're the adoption files for each child were created in order to justify putting the child up for adoption, not to record a truth of what happened to that child and why they were available for adoption in the first place. Okay, so these are difficult files to read, but you also, they're clear in some cases, right? You say a lieutenant, quote unquote, found this child wandering the hills outside of Chahul. We brought them into the orphanage. They're clearly abandoned by their family, totally ignoring the context of that so-called abandonment, right? So it's very surprising to kind of, not surprising, but it's jarring to read that bureaucratic language, right? Because it's like you've broken up this community and now you say that there's a child who has no community members and that's what makes them eligible for adoption. Okay. And so it's also kind of jarring to read inside the adoption files the letters from would-be adoptive parents who are writing to the orphanage saying, I wish to adopt a child because of X, Y, and Z. And this can range from evangelical Christians in the United States who wanted to save a soul. So it's a very colonial pattern that you see again in these more modern adoption files. Again, I'm mostly talking about the 1980s here. You see solidarity attempts, in some cases misguided, of left-wing people abroad who wanted to save a child in a difficult dirty war era conflict. So you just see like this broad mix of different adoptive parents. The kind of constant is lack of knowledge about, or perhaps lack of interest in what was happening on the ground in Guatemala. So that's the thing that you see in the files. I will also say, I'm going to go back to this photograph, one of the people in Guatemala who has been most vocal about the forcible adoptions, in defense of the forcible adoptions, is this man who is Benedicto Lucas Garcia, who was a general who was involved in the government during the genocides and was living in the areas, helping preside over the genocides. And he has said repeatedly in interviews and in a documentary that was made about him quite recently that one of the good things that the Guatemalan army did during the so-called genocide years, because as we will hear later today, there's a lot of genocide denial in Guatemala, but according to Benedicto Lucas Garcia, one of the so-called good things that the Guatemalan army did was to save a lot of children. So this is a discourse that is going to be familiar to anyone in the room. And he puts that in the kind of good ledger of what he said, that children were carried to safety in orphanages, children were well looked after, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Always with the implication being that children were not safe with their Mayan families. That's the kind of underlying discourse. So what else do the adoption files say? Again, in most cases where you have forcible adoptions around the world, this is unfortunately a very common pattern. You have in Guatemala, the conflict is a Cold War era conflict where you have the government talking about subversives, you have the government talking about communists, but you also have the kind of old colonial patterns of anti-Indigenous violence. The government thought that Mayan families by definition were dangerous because they were more inclined to be communists. The logic being they had been dispossessed of their lands, right? So if they were poor, they were thought to be more susceptible to becoming communists. So it's this kind of twisted logic. The point that I'm trying to make here is to say, in Guatemala, you have the Cold War era pattern and the colonial anti-Indigenous violence coexisting in one and the same conflict. And the kind of pattern of forcible adoptions elsewhere in the world during other periods, we heard about earlier today. The Canada case is horrifying, and as is the United States, Australia. So that I see that as kind of one pattern, right? And Guatemala belonging to that pattern as well in many ways. And then there was actually recently an article in the New York Times Magazine about the lost and stolen children of Spain under the Francoist dictatorship. So you have the kind of totalitarian flavor of this horrific phenomenon, often aided and abetted by the Catholic Church, which was a player also in Guatemala. And then finally, you have the commercial aspect, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about in my remaining 5 minutes. So yesterday we heard about child trafficking, early forms of child trafficking from Canada. In Guatemala, once there seemed to be a market for children put up for adoption abroad, the adoptions from Guatemala absolutely boomed. So here you see, this is a different time period. This is a later time period. So there were at least 500. We know that there are many more kids who were forcibly disappeared and then later put up for adoption during the conflict. But even after the conflict was over, you see this enormous boom in adoptions from Guatemala. These are not all Indigenous children. These are, in fact, not even, it's unclear how many of these children were Indigenous, but it may be half, it may be more, but it's not 99% is what I'm trying to say. So what are these cases that you're suddenly looking at here? What happened was during the conflict, adoptions were also privatized. The state adoptions continued on, but Congress in 1977 passed a law saying that you only needed a private lawyer and a judge to oversee an adoption. Sorry, you only needed a private lawyer to match a family and oversee the adoption. You didn't need the participation of a judge or of an orphanage. And suddenly that opened up a money-making opportunity for Guatemalan lawyers who stood to make between $10,000 and $40,000 US dollars per adoption, which is an enormous sum of money in Guatemala. So what happened is some of the tracks that were laid during the Civil War by forcible adoptions were sort of carried through, and this is the same in the Spanish case. There were the ideological adoptions of the Franco era, and then people started making money with adoptions. And so you had these horrible stories of thefts from hospital and all the rest of it, because these were commercial adoptions. So the big boom in Guatemala, where you have this purple representation, by the way, this is not adjusted for population. This is just in absolute numbers. And so Guatemala is a tiny country and is up there with China. Guatemala eventually ended international adoptions altogether because they found that there were too many abuses. It tended to be about the commercialization rather than about a recognition of the Indigenous kids who were forcibly adopted during the Civil War, and I'm happy to talk about that during questions. There's been a recognition of commercial adoptions in Guatemala as a bad thing that was done to Guatemalan families. There has not been a kind of wide recognition of the theft and adoption of Indigenous kids during the conflict. So that's a reckoning that's still ongoing. But during the kind of height of adoptions, 1 in 110 kids that were born in the country were adopted outside the country. So 1 in 110 is extraordinary. In 2006, right before adoptions were closed. And so you see the rapid decline is when adoptions were closed. Those are a couple of cases that were still in process that were seen through to the end. So I just want to conclude by saying there are people working on this in Guatemala. This is Marco Antonio Garavito, who is leading an NGO based in Guatemala City called Todos para el Reencuentro, which is trying to match adoptees who are looking for their birth parents with their biological families, if they so desire. So Mako is not Indigenous. He has one full-time co-worker who is Ixil, and he works with many Indigenous language translators because most of the adoptees that he is working with are looking for Indigenous families of various kinds. And so I just wanted to end on the note that it's not just Guatemalan society that is seeing a resurgence in Maya activism and Maya political organizing, asking for a plurinational state, for example. It's also the adoptees themselves. And so there's an adoptee organization in Guatemala, in the United States, called Next Generation Guatemala, which is led by a fabulous adoptee named Gemma Givens, who's learning her Indigenous language. So she learned about her history, learned that Spanish would not be the language, in fact, for her to learn. And she's helping many other adoptees get connected to their families through Mako's organization and others if they so desire. So I'm not saying that we're going to end with a happy story here, but there is quite a bit of activism and searching. DNA banks have changed absolutely everything in this regard, and we can talk more about that. But there is some recourse for families who are searching on their side and for adoptees who are searching on theirs. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much. I'll leave Mako out.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So now we'll open it up for about 15 minutes of Q&A.
I will always have a question. I'm curious in your research how much relationship with other countries this plays, and I say that considering El Salvador's history, like neighboring countries, there's a lot of independence that happen, and in particular, Indigenous female resistance pretty heavily. And yeah, I did my master's program in Costa Rica, and I worked at the Nicaragua border, so there's remnants, and I think kind of this underlying Indigenous understanding of adopting other people's children. And I think for Turtle Island, like the auntie system, those stereotypes play a role, but I also experienced some of that in Central America. So I'm curious though, in terms of qualitative but quantitative, how much of that did or didn't play in any of your research?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I did go to El Salvador. I originally thought that this book was going to be about both Guatemala and El Salvador because El Salvador has a parallel history. What I learned was that adoption files were not available. I went to ProBúsqueda, which is an organization that has been collecting them, and they said that for privacy reasons, those files would not be available to researchers for 50 years, which I understand. These are people's family stories. And so one of the issues of writing this history at all is using pseudonyms, making sure I'm not using identifying details. I mean, on the one hand, I want people to know these stories. On the other hand, should I as an outsider really be reading these files at all? So the numbers in El Salvador were lower. Thousands of kids were disappeared during the conflict there as well. Fewer of them were out adopted to the United States. And similarly to in Guatemala. So that's to answer the kind of first part of your question. And then the second part of your question about informal adoption within Indigenous communities is so important. We were just talking about this at the break, actually, which is there is a kind of minimizing discourse in Guatemala sometimes. If you talk to people about adoptions, this is a story that everyone in Guatemala knows. You know, if you meet someone randomly at a party or something and say, oh, I'm here to research adoption, they say, ooh, terrible story, it was just a business, right? They know the commercial side. But if you start talking about the kids who were adopted during the Civil War, after they were stolen, you can get a little bit of, well, someone had to adopt them, you know, they were orphans or they were lost from their families. And it's just not true. If you read the documentation from during the war, you can see that the refugee community in Mexico was very actively raising kids from their community. Everyone was adopted, but because it was an informal adoption, it's kind of hard to trace in terms of documentation if that's what you're looking for. But it's very obvious that from all of the research that I've done, the vast majority of kids who were affected by the violence in Guatemala were adopted informally in their communities. The second largest group, which I didn't even mention, were dragooned into domestic service, were forced into domestic service by Guatemalan military officials. So that's something, if you want to know more about it, there's a documentary called Finding Oscar that's really worth watching, among other things. And then the kind of less large, but I think very important group are the kids who were formally adopted through the state orphanage system. So by the numbers, that's not the largest group. But as an experience, it's really important to underline that Maya communities were taking care of their own all throughout the war, whenever they could. And many of the most painful parts of the adoption files to read are when it's clear that a grandparent or an auntie or someone showed up to the orphanage looking for a child, and the state orphanage, because they could not verify that familial link, proceeded to put the child up for adoption anyway. And that does occur. You do see that in the adoption documentation. And that's I mean, it's all disturbing to read, but that's one of the hardest things to read.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a lot of thoughts and questions, but I think the two that right now I'm thinking most about is you mentioned that you mainly used adoption files as your sources, and I was wondering if you were able to access other primary sources or and I know you mentioned that you don't speak indigenous languages, but I was wondering if you were able to access any sources or maybe interviews of those communities and getting their perspectives. And then my second question was, I know the presentation focuses on those 500 children who were adopted, but I was also wondering if you could tell us a little bit more what happened to the other children who were not adopted. And thank you again so much.
Thank you so much. As people here may know, the USC has a collection of interviews that are available, and not necessarily on this topic, but about wartime experiences. And in Guatemala, there are a wealth of sources, right? So the adoption files were the backbone of this project in a lot of ways, but the Truth Commission reports interviewed a huge number of people. As I said yesterday, they weren't always asking the right questions, right? Or they weren't always asking about sexual violence against women. They weren't always asking about cornfields. They weren't always asking about children, but there is a lot of information nevertheless. So if you go to the archives of the Catholic Church Truth Commission, in particular in Guatemala City, there's a lot of information about testimonies of people whose children were taken. So that's a source that is there, that exists, that you can access without kind of asking people to tell you their story again or something like that. Another source has been interviews with lawyers who were involved in the private adoption schemes, and hearing their views on some of the Indigenous women who put their children up for adoption. Also not a pleasant experience in every case, to put it mildly. But they're actually Guatemala, for all of its difficulties during the war, actually has a wealth of a real tradition of oral history, not of foreigners coming in and doing it, but a tradition of oral history in the country. Anthropologists like Irma Alicia Nimatur, who helped organize this conference. I mean, there's just a wealth of research that you can draw on without necessarily speaking the languages. But again, I say it's a real limitation because yesterday we were talking about the photographs that were taken from the settler view, and here what I'm talking about is not the Indigenous family's experience. What I'm talking about is the Guatemalan state's logic and process and outcome of what they were doing with the kids, which I think is valuable, but you don't want to confuse the one with the other. And then in terms of what happened to the other kids, a lot of kids escaped with their families. They fled to southern Mexico. Some of them fled up to Guatemala. A lot of kids survived and thrived and speak their languages. And you know, we were talking about some of these issues this morning about schooling, desire to speak languages or not, fear of parents, where maybe children would want to have a claim on that identity. That's a dynamic that you see in Guatemala too, right? Like it's pretty common to me. I'm 37. It's pretty common to meet someone my age or a little bit younger who is only learning indigenous languages now because their parents were too afraid to teach them in the home during the war. So that's a dynamic that's still ongoing. I don't want to make it sound like, and now everyone speaks their languages and proudly. There's still a lot of discrimination and a lot of fear, but a lot of children were able to stay with their extended families throughout the war. That's the kind of side story to the adoptions, parallel story.
Thank you for such a great presentation. I was wondering if you come across the documentation that you found, something about telling how the procedure was from the military when they were invading and taking those kids. If you can explain us a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, it's euphemisms in the document, right? So you see this child was remitted by a lieutenant on this date. But that's where interviews have been and oral histories have been useful in filling in some of the details, because I was able to confirm with some social workers who had worked in close proximity to the military during the Civil War that they would just directly get a phone call from military officers after a massacre. So a social worker was flown to northern Guatemala, Petén, the jungle, after an attack there, and brought children back on a military helicopter. So it was a very direct link. In terms of culpability for social workers, I'm not entirely sure what that means, because many of them thought that they were working, in the immortal phrase, in the best interests of the child. So that's, again, a phrase that's very familiar from other contexts. But the procedure, again, we were talking about intent yesterday. This was not a plan. It's not as if there was a plan to take X number of children. There was no quota, as we've seen in some other cases. However, if you look at the military plans from these periods, famously Operation Sophia is one, and there are others that you could name, you can see that the social welfare programs are being extended into conflict areas. So it's also not random. So it's somewhere in between, if that makes sense. But the social workers were working very closely with the military.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to follow up on this question about what is kind of depicted in the film Finding Oscar, which we launched here at USC, actually. And so, because it never occurred to me to ask, and I think this is really interesting and coming up from your talk, when military personnel took on kids as kind of servants or as raising them as their own child, did they ever formally adopt them? And how was this procedure? And is this part of this whole kind of, or is there a difference between these international adoptions? And
that's a great question. So the Guatemalan military officials who stole children and kept them instead of putting them up for adoption through the domestic system, it's a little bit more like the Argentine experience, actually, where some of the children were adopted, and I'll say what that means, but others were kept as domestic servants. The word, it's a horrible word, that was used was mascotas, as literally as pets. So they were kept on military bases and made to do domestic labor. I mean, that's the answer. I'm sorry that that's the answer, but it is. And those who were adopted, this was highly racialized, right? So the kids that were whiter tended to be more frequent, like Oscar is a whiter phenotypically looking Guatemalan child. They tended to be adopted more frequently by Guatemalan military families. We don't know the number, right? Because that's impossible to know. But what that generally meant was not going through the state orphanage and the entire adoption system, because there are actually earlier cases from before the genocide where you have a rich Guatemalan family calling up the state orphanage saying, hey, we've taken in this kid informally. We need you to process the adoption for us. And the state orphanage says, no, that's not the law. You have to go through the whole system. You have to be matched. You can't just take in a kid and then have us rubber stamp it. And it became clear that what a lot of Guatemalan families, even before the genocide, were doing was just inscribing kids as their own in the civil registry. So the easiest way to do an adoption is to take a kid to the equivalent of get a birth certificate for a kid that's in your name instead of in the birth mother's name. This sounds kind of wild in the US context. In the Guatemalan context, it's not that crazy, because if you live in a rural area, for example, you may not take your kid to the civil registry to have them registered until they're a bit older. So it's a little bit less weird to show up with a 3-year-old and say, hey, this is my kid, they were born on this date. Can you, do the paperwork for me? So what we know about some of the cases of military officials stealing kids and then quote unquote adopting them is that adoption was falsified paperwork. And the way that paperwork was falsified was that they would just take them to the civil registry and inscribe them as their own kid, which makes it, especially before DNA testing, unbelievably difficult to trace who your birth family was, because not just have you been stolen, but the papers have been falsified.
Thank you so much for what was a really great presentation. Could you say a little bit more about actually the DNA testing? I think that's really fascinating. In the U.S. context, there's a lot of concern about genomic information and, groups trying to regulate that. But it'd be really interesting to hear your perspective on what's going on with that.
One of the groups that is offering DNA testing for families who lost loved ones, including children, during the conflict is the Forensic Anthropologists of Guatemala, which I know is a partner for USC as well. For some of the interviews that you host, the interviews that you have on your website here, the forensic anthropologists in Guatemala were trained by the forensic anthropologists of Argentina. This is a kind of movement around Latin America to find out what the bones can tell us, right? So to find common graves, to find that information. The DNA testing is offered, and some of this has gone away toward finding some of the stolen children of Argentina as well, to try to make matches. So it's, in this context, it's kind of less controversial than the way we might see DNA testing here in the US, which is, ooh, why should I send my genetic material to a for-profit corporation? On the contrary, a lot of Guatemalan adoptees in particular, who have found that they have falsified paperwork, have been able to successfully use 23andMe and some of these other for-profit companies to find not just birth parents, but siblings. I haven't mentioned siblings in this presentation, but many of the children who were put up for adoption, either forcibly during the Civil War or later as part of the more commercially oriented adoptions, had siblings who remained with their birth families, or who were put up for adoption in other parts of the country or world. So there was no prohibition on putting siblings up for adoption separately. And so in some cases, people are finding out about half siblings and siblings that they did not even know that they had. One last note on DNAs, and then I will leave it there, is not all adoptions from Guatemala were forcible. Not all women were coerced into giving consent. In a country where birth control is not available, abortion remains illegal, and economic opportunities for women are severely limited, and many women are raising children by themselves. Some women chose to put their children up for adoption, whatever that means in a context of, extreme economic deprivation. And in some cases, it was to avoid potential domestic violence. A lot of families were affected by migration, partners coming to the United States to work, the male partner. What happened if the woman was pregnant when that person was away? Adoptions, in some cases, provided an opportunity for women to rewrite their stories, have a pregnancy not have happened. So the fact that people are able through DNA testing to find some of these women can be tricky, and the approach can be difficult, because if you are an adoptee, you don't know what kind of story you are finding out about, unless your adoption file is accurate, which some of them, many of them are. So I just wanted to introduce that there is a kind of twist to some of the DNA testing. When women put up their children for adoption as a choice that they made in their lives, they maybe didn't foresee the access that DNA testing would give their children to them in the future. So that's just a kind of open question. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm sure I'm not the only one that's looking forward to your book when it comes out.